The lamp in the kitchen window burned until noon the following day, when the wick finally exhausted the last of the oil and went dark on its own. No one was there to see it go out. May Calloway had been walking for 8 hours by then south along the ridge trail that traced the spine of the Cumberland Plateau, like a seam sewn by someone who understood that mountains like grief require a clear line to follow, or you lose yourself entirely in the middle of them. She had left at 4 in the morning, not because 4 in the morning was a meaningful hour, not because she had calculated the darkness, but because she had been awake since 1, and by 4 the weight of lying still in a bed that was the wrong temperature on the wrong side had become something she could no longer carry without moving. She rose without lighting the lamp. She dressed in the dark by feel, pulling on the heavy wool skirt she wore for fence mending, the flannel shirtwaist with the repaired collar, the boots she had resoled herself 2 seasons ago with leather cut from a ruined harness. She tied the laces in the dark, and they were even because 63 years of tying bootlaces in the dark teaches a woman's fingers to know the tension without needing the light. The canvas sack was already packed. She had packed it 3 nights before, and then unpacked it, and then packed it again, not because the contents changed, but because the act of packing and unpacking was the only conversation she could have with herself about what she was doing, and the conversation needed repeating before it became a decision rather than a compulsion. In the end, the sack held a spare dress, a wool shawl, a tin cup, a skinning knife Dale had kept on the peg by the door for 42 years, a half wheel of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, a double handful of dried beans in a muslin bag, a box of matches in a tobacco tin, and the $23 she had taken from the hidden clay jar behind the flour bin. She did not take the photograph of Dale from the mantel. She was not trying to forget him. She was trying to outpace a version of herself that would not survive if she stayed in the same 4 walls, that still smelled of his pipe tobacco and his liniment, and the particular warm weather smell of a man who worked outdoors and came inside with the outdoors still on him. She walked out the front door and did not look back at the lamp burning in the kitchen window. She had considered leaving a note for Curtis, but had sat with the blank paper for long enough to understand that there was nothing she could write that he would read the way she meant it. Any note she left would be used as evidence of something: her instability, her grief, her inability to make rational decisions, and the last thing May Calloway was doing at 4 in the morning with a packed second $23 was making an irrational decision. She was making the most rational decision she had made in 40 years. She was choosing the outcome of her own life before someone else chose it for her. The path south along the ridge was not a road. It had never been a road. It was the kind of trail that accumulates over generations of people and animals, moving between the same 2 points for reasons no one bothers to record, wearing the earth down to bare rock and root in some stretches and losing itself entirely in the undergrowth in others, so that walking it required a combination of memory and instinct that May had developed over 6 decades of living on the plateau. She had walked sections of this trail every autumn to pick chinquapins from the groves on the south-facing slopes. She had walked it the winter she was 31, pregnant with Curtis, carrying salt to the Beaumont family, whose husband had broken his leg and could not get to the Pikeville store. She had walked it alone and with Dale, and twice when Curtis was young enough to be carried in a back sling, but old enough to be annoyed about it. She knew where the trail dropped steeply over exposed limestone and where it widened into a flat bench of meadow that caught the morning light so cleanly that even in November it felt briefly like spring. She knew these things the way she knew the feel of her own bootlaces in the dark, not by thinking, by having been. The morning she walked out for the last time, the plateau was holding its breath in the particular way it does in late September, when the summer has finally accepted its ending, but the fall has not yet committed to the cold. The sky was the dark blue of deep water. The stars were the kind that mountain people grow up understanding are not decorative. They navigated by them the same way their grandparents had navigated by them, not as a skill cultivated for romance, but as a practical response to the fact that the moon was not always available and lanterns used oil. May walked south by the stars for the first 2 hours, and then by the light that came slowly gray and then gold over the eastern ridge, and the world assembled itself around her one color at a time, the way it always does, indifferent to the concerns of the people walking through it. She did not allow herself to think about Dale directly for those first hours. She thought around him the way you skirt ice on a creek that you are not certain will hold. She thought about the corn he had planted in the north field and never harvested. She thought about the specific angle at which he held his coffee cup. Left hand only, thumb through the handle tilted slightly outward as though preparing to offer it to someone. She thought about the sound of his boots on the porch steps, 3 steps the middle. One always the loudest because of the soft spot in the board that he had intended to replace every single spring for a decade. She thought about these things and they were tolerable because they were specific. And specific things have edges, and things with edges can be held without drowning in them. What she did not let herself think about was the evening of August the 9th when she had walked out to the north field at 4:30 to bring Dale his water jug and found him face down in the dirt between the 4th and 5th rows of corn. She had stood at the field's edge for a moment that she would never be able to measure, looking at the shape of him on the ground, the way his left arm was extended as though reaching for something just beyond his fingers. And she had understood before she reached him, understood with a certainty that required no confirmation, the way a woman who has lived beside a man for 42 years understands the difference between the shape of him resting and the shape of him gone. She had sat beside him until dark, not because she was in shock, though she was. Not because she was unable to move, though she was that too. She sat because she was saying goodbye without words, which was the only kind of goodbye she and Dale had ever really been capable of. They had been married at 19, both of them, in a ceremony that lasted 11 minutes in the Pikeville Methodist Church, and in 42 years, they had never once said "I love you" in a way that required the actual words. It had been in the coffee cup angled outward. It had been in the repaired collar. It had been in 42 years of not leaving. Curtis arrived for the funeral on a Tuesday. He came on the train from Chattanooga to Pikeville and then hired a wagon up to the Hollow, and he arrived in the late afternoon wearing a coat May had never seen before, which meant he had bought it for the occasion, which meant he had known what kind of occasion this was going to be before he arrived. He was 38 years old, and he looked it in a way that made May feel the time strangely, because the last time she had allowed herself to really look at him, he had been 17 and climbing onto the wagon to Pikeville with a single bag, in the particular expression of a boy who has decided that the most important thing is to not look back. He had not looked back. She had watched from the porch until the wagon rounded the bend, and she had understood that this was the shape their relationship was going to take. She would watch, he would go. He was not a bad man. That was the complicated part. He had sent money every Christmas without fail, a postal order and a card that always said "Merry Christmas." Mother in his clerk's handwriting, precise and legible, and entirely without warmth. He had written 4 times a year with news of his work at the courthouse, his progress with the Methodist Fellowship in Chattanooga, the state of his health. The letters were informative, incomplete, and contained nothing of himself. He had learned somewhere in the transition from the boy on the wagon to the man in the new funeral coat to communicate without revealing, and May had read his letters with the particular sadnesses of a woman who recognizes in her child a skill she herself never mastered and is not certain she should have taught. The first night he was there, they sat on the porch after supper and did not speak much. The second day, they buried Dale in the churchyard at Pikeville with the preacher from the Methodist congregation saying the words that preachers say, words that are true enough in the general sense, but have nothing to do with the specific man in the specific box. May wore her dark dress and her good hat and stood at the graveside with her hands folded and looked at the hole in the Tennessee earth and thought, 42 years and now a hole. She did not cry at the graveside. She had cried already alone on the nights between finding him and burying him, in the way that grief actually moves through a body when there is no audience for it, which is nothing like what anyone who has never lost someone imagines it to be. It is not dramatic. It is not cinematic. It is specific and small and relentless, like water finding the lowest point. The third day, Curtis put a paper on the kitchen table. He set it down beside her coffee cup with a care that told her he had been thinking about the placement, about the angle, about the way to present a thing that he knew she was not going to receive well. He sat down across from her and folded his hands on the table, the gesture of a man preparing to deliver information in a professional capacity, and May looked at the paper before he said anything, because she was 63 years old and she had learned to read the intention of a document from its physical weight before she read a word of it. It was from the Pikeville Savings and Loan. It had Dale's name on it and a number that took her a moment to understand, not because the number was complicated, but because the concept behind it required her to reorganize information she had held as settled. The mortgage, 6 years of it. Dale had taken the loan in 1891 to expand the North Field, to buy the seed drill and the new plow, and he had been servicing it quietly from the farm's earnings in a way that left enough for the household without ever requiring May to know. She had known in a general way that there was a bank arrangement. She had not known the amount or the terms or the fact that the land itself was the collateral, because Dale had been a man of his era and his place, which is to say, a man who managed the financial architecture of his household as a private concern, not out of dishonesty, but out of a deep and habitual belief that the woman's domain and the man's domain were separate territories, and that to bring the financial worry into the domestic space was a kind of failure. He had not meant it as a secret. He had meant it as a kindness. May understood this in the same moment that she understood it had left her at 63, with no land, no resources, and a son sitting across the table with his hands folded in a document that explained why. She picked up the paper. She read it completely, which took 4 minutes. She set it down exactly where it had been. She drank her coffee. Curtis watched her do all of this with the expression of a man who has prepared for several versions of a response and is recalculating which version applies. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his new coat and took out a second piece of paper. This one folded smaller, and he unfolded it on the table beside the first one with the same deliberate care. And this piece of paper had the words Pikeville Methodist Home for the Elderly at the top in printed letters. He had a speech prepared. She could hear it in the way he began, the cadence of it, the transitional phrases that linked one point to the next in the way of a man who has rehearsed. It was a good speech. It acknowledged her situation with respect. It described the Methodist home with accuracy, which she did not doubt because Curtis was a courthouse man, and a courthouse man does not misrepresent facts. He said the word comfortable 3 times. He said the word community. He said the words well supervised and medically attended, and May noticed that all of the appealing words were passive constructions, things that would be done to her rather than things she would do, and she filed this observation away without interrupting him. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the September wind against the window glass and the creak of the porch boards settling in the mid-morning heat. May looked at the paper with the Methodist home letterhead. She looked at it for long enough that Curtis began to believe she was reading it, but she was not reading it. She was looking at the words Pikeville Methodist Home for the Elderly, the way you look at a door you have no intention of walking through, studying its dimensions simply to understand what you are refusing. She picked up her coffee cup. She set it down. She folded her hands on the table in the same configuration as his, which she did without thinking about it, and Curtis noticed and something moved across his face that was not quite recognition, but was close to it, the ghost of the gesture being returned. Then she said, "I need to think about this." And he nodded because it was a reasonable thing to say, and because it gave him permission to believe that thinking about it was a step on the road to agreeing with it. And May let him believe that because she was 63 years old and she had learned that the most valuable thing you can give a determined person is a reason to stop pushing. That night, she did not sleep. She did not try to sleep. She sat in the kitchen chair Dale had always sat in because it was slightly taller than the others on account of his bad knee requiring a straighter angle, and she sat in his chair and thought with a clarity that grief sometimes produces when it has burned through all the softer material and got it down to the structural truth of things. She thought about the Methodist home and the word comfortable. She thought about the hallway she would walk every day and the window that would look out at whatever a window in Pikeville looks out at, which is to say at other people's lives, ranged for viewing from a distance. She thought about the meals that would arrive at scheduled hours and the people who would bring them, who would call her Mrs. Calloway, in the slightly elevated volume reserved for the old, as though old age were a hearing condition rather than a duration. She thought about what it would mean to have her day organized by other people's notions of what her day should contain, and the thought produced in her chest a sensation that was not grief and not rage, but was something older than both, something that predated language, the wordless animal refusal of a creature that understands instinctively the difference between shelter and a cage. At 3 in the morning, she got up and went to the flour bin and moved it aside and took the clay jar from behind it. The jar had been there for 11 years. She had started it the spring of 1886 when the egg money had been particularly good, and she had decided without telling Dale and without examining too closely why she was not telling him to keep a separate reserve. Not for any specific purpose, just to have it, just to hold in her hand the material fact of her own capacity to accumulate separate from the household accounts, separate from Dale's domain of private geography of her own making. $23, a year and a half of egg money carriage fee tips from when she had driven the neighbor's wagon, and one payment of $4 from a woman in Pikeville who had wanted May's recipe for the walnut liniment she made each fall. $23 was not a fortune. $23 was not enough to start a new life in any of the ways that phrase is usually meant. But $23 was enough to start a different kind of life, the kind that does not require a building or a plan or anyone's permission. She put the money in the inside pocket of her shirtwaist. She finished packing the canvas sack which she had been packing in her mind for 2 days already. She put on her boots in the dark, tied the laces, by Phil shouldered the sack, and walked out the front door into the 4 o'clock darkness. Without looking at the lamp she left burning on the kitchen table, which was the last light Dale had used, which was the last light in a place that was no longer hers. The ridge trail in the dark was known to her body in a way that did not require the mind's active participation. She walked it the way she had walked it dozens of times, with the plateau's particular pre-dawn silence around her, which is not the silence of absence, but the silence of held breath. Every creature of the night settling, and every creature of the day not yet stirring, the world paused between its own two versions of itself. Her feet found the limestone outcroppings without her looking down. Her shoulders adjusted to the pitch of the descent into the first hollow without conscious calculation. She was not a young woman on an adventure. She was an old woman in her own landscape moving through it with the authority of long acquaintance. The first day was the hardest in the physical sense, because her body, which had been grieving without moving for 3 weeks since Dale's death, had tightened in ways she could feel in her hips and her lower back during the first 2 miles. She stopped on a flat rock above the first creek crossing and removed her right boot and rubbed the tendon along the outside of her ankle, which had been unreliable since she had twisted it on the cellar steps the winter before last. She put the boot back on, tightened the lace 1 increment above comfortable, and continued. This was 63 years of managing a body that had been asked to do difficult things. You make the adjustment, you continue. You do not negotiate with the pain as though it has a right to decide the outcome. She ate the hard cheese and some dried beans soaked in creek water for her noon meal, sitting on a south-facing ledge above the valley where the afternoon sun came in at an angle that warmed the stone enough to sit on without discomfort. She could see the smoke from 3 different chimneys in the hollow below her, and the glint of a tin roof that had not been there 2 years ago. Someone new in the hollow. Someone building. She watched the smoke rise and dissipate and thought about how a chimney is a kind of signal that is entirely automatic, announcing your location and your habits and the fact of your survival to anyone with the elevation to see it, and how for 42 years her chimney had been broadcasting her location to the world, and how for the first time in 42 years she was not broadcasting anything. She slept the first night in the lee of a limestone outcropping on the east face of the ridge, where the rock held the day's warmth past sunset and the wind broke against the upper face and missed the hollow entirely. She arranged herself against the stone with her sack as a pillow and the shawl over her shoulders, and lay looking up at the sky, which was clear and full of stars. And she thought, this is the first night I have slept outdoors since I was 26, which was the summer she and Dale had driven cattle to the Crossville market and camped 2 nights on the trail. 40 years of sleeping indoors of walls and a roof and the same ceiling viewed from the same angle every night. Now the ceiling was the entire sky and the stars were moving in their slow drift from east to west, and the plateau was breathing its cold night breath against her face, and she was not comfortable exactly, but she was something more useful than comfortable. She was present. She was outside of the 4 walls that smelled of pipe tobacco and liniment. She was moving even in stillness, away from the shape of a life that had ended and towards something she could not yet name. The second day, she made better time because her body had remembered what walking asked of it. The tendon in her ankle loosened by mid-morning. Her pace settled into the rhythm she had always found on long walks, slightly slower than young people's pace, considerably more sustainable, the pace of a woman who has never needed to prove her urgency to anyone. She moved through a stand of old-growth hemlock that the logging companies had not yet reached the trees 100 feet tall, and more their trunks the diameter of a small room, the light coming down through them in long vertical columns like the interior of a cathedral that had decided to skip the architecture and get directly to the feeling. The undergrowth beneath the hemlocks was rhododendron dense and tangled. The branches knotted together in a way that forced her to move sideways through the thickest sections, pushing through with her shoulder first and letting the canvas sack pass after. She crossed the Soquatchie Creek at the shallow ford above the old Meacham farm, which had been abandoned for 20 years or more, the cabin fallen in on itself, the chimney standing alone in the middle of what had been the house like a monument to the absence of everything that had surrounded it. She stopped at the chimney for a moment, looked at it. A stone chimney outlasts the house, outlasts the family, outlasts the reason it was built. It stands in its field being a chimney long after it has lost all context. She was not certain whether this was reassuring or terrible, and concluded that it was probably both and continued across the ford, the creek cold enough to make her gasp when it came over the top of her boot, which it did at mid-crossing because she misjudged the depth by 2 inches, a misjudgment that cost her a wet right sock for the rest of the afternoon. That night, she found a barn-sized overhang of limestone on the west-facing slope above a nameless creek and slept better than she had slept since August, which surprised her because the stone was harder than the earth beside the outcropping the night before, and the temperature had dropped into what felt like the high 40s. She slept deeply and without dreaming, and woke before first light feeling for the first time in 6 weeks like a person who had rested. She understood lying on the stone in the pre-dawn dark that this was meaningful, that the body knows things the mind argues with, that her body had been refusing the bed in the cabin and the mattress that held the impression of Dale's weight and the pillow that held his smell, refusing all of it because sleep in those conditions was not rest, but a continued argument with absence. Out here on stone in the cold with nothing to argue against, the body had simply stopped fighting and done what bodies do when left to their own authority. It had healed incrementally for 6 hours. On the third afternoon, she heard the waterfall. She was following a hollow down toward the creek at the valley bottom, moving through a section of forest that was old enough to have developed its own understory, ecology ferns and mosses and small-leafed plants. She did not have names for growing in the permanent shade beneath a canopy of hardwoods that had never been cut. The going was slow because the slope was steep and the leaves had begun to fall and covered the exposed roots in a way that made each step a small negotiation with the possibility of a turned ankle. She was picking her way carefully, her attention divided between the ground immediately in front of her and the need to maintain a general southward bearing when the sound reached her. She stopped. She stood with her head slightly lifted the way an animal stands when it has registered something before the conscious mind has cataloged what the something is. The sound was layered, a low continuous roar that was the mass of the water, and inside it a higher, more variable sound that was the individual threads of the fall breaking against the rocks at the base, and inside that, a fine, almost inaudible shimmer that was the mist against the leaves of the rhododendron at the water's edge. She had heard waterfalls before. There were a dozen on the plateau that she knew by name, and several more she knew by location without a name. This sound was larger than the ones she knew, and coming from a direction she had not explored, which meant it was far enough from the ridge trail that the trail walkers had never thought to record it. She moved toward it, pushing through the rhododendron, the branches catching at her shawl, and the canvas sack forcing her sideways again, left shoulder leading. She descended the last 50 feet of slope in a series of careful lateral steps, the exposed limestone wet under the fallen leaves, and came out suddenly onto the rocks at the base of the falls, and the roar of it surrounded her completely, the way a sound can become an environment when it is large enough. The waterfall was 15 feet wide and 20 feet tall, pouring over a limestone ledge into a pool that caught the last of the afternoon light and held it briefly gold before the surface broke and broke again in the falling water's turbulence. The pool was 8 feet deep at the center and drained through a gravel channel to the south, the water running clear over the limestone riverbed. Around the pool, the rocks were green with moss and wet from the spray, and the rhododendron grew to the water's edge on both sides, and the hemlocks on the slope above closed the hollow at the top so that the whole space had the quality of a room that had been built by the landscape rather than by a person, a room with stone walls and a canopy roof and a waterfall for a fourth wall. May stood on the dry rocks at the pool's edge and looked up at the falling water. In late September, the water had thinned from the summer flow, not to the veil it would become in deep drought, but enough that the curtain was semi-transparent. In places, the rock face behind it visible as a shadow, a darker shape behind the moving water. She looked at the shadow for a moment, processing what she was seeing. Not a shadow, a recession in the rock, a gap. The limestone behind the waterfall was not flat, but recessed, set back from the line of the curtain, and the recession was large enough to be more than a crack or depression. It was large enough to be a space. She climbed the wet rocks beside the falls, without allowing herself to think too carefully about whether this was a reasonable thing to attempt at 63 with a wet right boot and a tendon that bore watching. 63 years had taught her that excessive deliberation at the moment of physical action is itself a risk factor because hesitation and a moss-covered limestone surface combine badly. She moved with the deliberate confidence of a woman who has spent a lifetime on difficult terrain, placing each foot with precision, using both hands on the rock face to balance. And when she reached the level of the ledge, she moved laterally across the rock face until she was at the curtain's edge, the thinnest part of the flow where it curved around the southern face of the limestone outcropping, and she stepped through. The water hit her left shoulder and the left side of her face and soaked her hair and the left sleeve and shoulder of her dress, and it was cold, the specific cold of mountain water in September that is not fully summer warm and not yet winter cold, but is exactly cold enough to take the breath and remind the body of its fragility. She gasped. She stepped forward onto the dry limestone of the ledge and stood dripping. She stood still for a moment, letting her breathing settle, letting her eyes adjust from the bright outdoor light to the diffused green-gold light that filtered through the falling water in front of her. Then she turned and looked at the space behind her. The ledge was deep, 8 feet from the curtain's edge to the back wall, maybe more. The width was considerable. She would need to measure. The ceiling was a solid overhang of the upper limestone layer, uncracked, bearing the hillside above it, with the settled authority of stone that has been in this configuration for longer than human memory can reach. The floor was level, limestone dry under her feet, despite the waterfall 3 feet in front of her, because the water fell straight down from the lip above, and the ledge's depth kept it clear of the splash zone except for a light spray at the very edge. The back wall was rough limestone, pocked and uneven, the exposed face of a softer rock layer that the water had spent millennia eating away to create this space. She pressed her palm against it. It was dry, cool on the surface. And behind the cool surface, deep in the stone, there was something else, a steadiness of temperature that was not the temperature of the outside air in September, but was its own temperature, constant, independent of the season, the temperature of the Earth's interior leaking slowly through hundreds of feet of rock. She stood with her palm flat against the back wall and listened to the waterfall with the wall's temperature moving through her hand into her bones. Then she turned and faced the space. She did what she had done on arriving at every new property or new building she had ever assessed. In 63 years, she began to measure it, not with instruments, with herself. She paced the width heel to toe, counting carefully 14 feet. She paced the depth 8 feet in a handspan. She looked at the ceiling at the front edge, 7 feet her arm extended overhead, cleared it with 6 inches to spare. At the back wall, the ceiling sloped 5 feet, which meant she would need to stoop slightly at the back, but could stand fully upright in the front 2/3 of the space. She noted where the floor was flattest, which was the center section from the north wall's natural narrowing. She noted where the back wall had a natural recess that would serve as a shelf without any modification. She noted the gap at the top of the back wall where it met the ceiling formation, a narrow fissure that ran the horizontal length of the junction through which she could feel when she pressed her face near it, a faint but definite upward current of air. She was 63 years old, and she had spent 42 of those years managing a household, which is to say she had spent 42 years solving spatial problems, resource problems, and thermal problems with whatever materials were available and no margin for waste. She looked at the ledge behind the waterfall with the same methodical eye she had turned on every problem that had ever been presented to her, and she cataloged shelter. Yes. Concealment, yes. Fresh water available at the curtain's edge. Ventilation adequate via the fissure. Thermal mass, the back wall alone was significant, and with a heat source, the mass would multiply the efficiency of that source by a factor she could estimate based on her experience with the cabin's stone fireplace. She would need a fire. She would need a wall at the front to manage the mist and the cold air displacement from the curtain. She would need a sleeping surface elevated from the floor. She would need fuel and food and a way to get both without announcing herself. She stood in the center of the dry limestone floor with the waterfall pouring 3 feet in front of her and the sound of it filling every available space in her hearing, and she felt something happen in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. It was not joy. She had not felt joy in 6 weeks, and she did not expect to feel it now. And if she had felt it, she would have distrusted it as the kind of emotional misfiring that happens to people in acute stress. It was not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. It was more structural than relief. It was the sensation of a weight finding its proper resting place after being carried at the wrong angle, the feeling of alignment of a thing placed correctly in a space that turns out to have been made for it. She was going to stay here. Not because the decision emerged from an analysis, though the analysis supported it. Not because she had nowhere else to go, though this was also true. She was going to stay here because something in her body, which was smarter than her mind in this moment, had understood in the first 30 seconds of standing on this ledge that she was not in a waterfall. She was home. The categories had been rearranged. The thing she had been building toward for 63 years without knowing she was building toward. It was not the cabin in the hollow with the lamp in the window and the clay jar behind the flower bin. It was this a dry room of her own making behind a curtain of water, invisible to the world, warm with her own carefully maintained fire, measured with her own feet. She sat down with her back against the warm stone of the back wall. The waterfall light moved across the limestone ceiling above her in patterns that were gold and green and white, constantly shifting the light animated by the water's movement in a way that made the ceiling appear to breathe. She watched it breathe. She watched the day change in the falling water in front of her. The light moving through its arc, the gold of late afternoon softening to the cooler silver of near evening, and she breathed in time with the stone above her, and she did not count the minutes because there was nothing left that the minutes needed to add up to. She was not at the end of a life. She was at the beginning of a different one, the one that had been underneath the other all along, waiting behind the curtain like a room no one had thought to look for, because no one would look behind a waterfall, for a woman who had walked away from everything that had been decided for her toward the one thing that was solely hers to decide. Outside, the hollow filled slowly with shadow. The waterfall changed pitch slightly as the evening cooled and contracted the air in the hollow. A wood thrush called once from the hemlock slope above its note, rising and falling, in the weight of a question without urgency, the kind of question that does not require an answer because the asking is sufficient. May Calloway listened to the thrush and listened to the water and let the warm stone wall behind her give back the heat it had been holding since the last sun touched the cliff face above, and she did not look south for what was coming, and she did not look north at what she had left, because the only direction that held anything real for her now was inward into the stone, into the warmth that the mountain held without effort and would share without condition. She pulled her shawl over her wet shoulder, folded her canvas sack into a pillow, lay down on the limestone floor with the waterfall sound surrounding her like the walls of the safest room she had ever slept in, and she closed her eyes. In the morning there would be work to do. The wall came first because without the wall nothing else was possible. May understood this before she understood much else about the ledge, in the way that a woman who has spent decades managing a working household develops the ability to see a space not as it is, but as it must become, to look at raw conditions and identify immediately the single intervention that unlocks everything subsequent. The front of the ledge was the problem. The waterfall 3 feet beyond the edge created a continuous cold draft as the falling water displaced the air in the hollow below, drawing heat off the ledge the way a chimney draws smoke efficiently and without mercy. The mist that accompanied this draft settled on every surface at the front of the space and worked its way inward, not in a flood but in accumulation, the way cold always defeats warmth when given enough time, and surface area 1 degree at a time. Without a barrier, the ledge in October was uncomfortable. In January, it would be a 40-degree room with no walls and a waterfall for a front door, which was not a room at all. It was a shelf of rock in a hollow where a person could die of exposure with remarkable efficiency. She spent the first full day assessing material, not gathering yet, assessing. She walked the slope above the cliff in both directions, identifying the limestone outcroppings where flat slabs had already been separated by freeze-thaw cycles and lay waiting to be moved, inventorying the size and thicknesses of what was available, calculating what could be carried by a woman of her build across wet, mossy rock without risking the ankle or a worse outcome. She examined the rockfall at the base of the cliff on both sides of the waterfall, where decades of spalling had produced a natural collection of limestone pieces in a range of sizes, some flat and useful, some irregular and less so. She examined the creek bed in both directions and found a section 40 yards south where the current had sorted the stones by size over centuries, leaving a deposit of flat river stones, roughly palm-sized to double palm-sized swollen, that were dense and smooth and would serve as a hearth surface better than the rougher cliff face material. She built a mental inventory before she lifted a single stone, and the inventory told her she had enough material within a reasonable carry radius to build what she needed. This was the first time since August 9th that she had looked at a problem and found at the end of the assessment that the resources were adequate. The sensation was small, but it was real. The specific satisfaction of a solvable problem in a season of unsolvable ones, and she held it carefully and did not make too much of it and went to sleep on the stone floor with her shawl pulled tight and her canvas sack under her head, and the waterfall's voice filling the hollow all through the night. The construction of the front wall took 11 days. She worked in the mornings when the light was best and the temperature had risen enough that her hands retained their dexterity, stopping at midday to eat and rest the ankle, resuming in the early afternoon until the light failed. The wall ran the full 14-foot width of the ledge, positioned 2 feet back from the edge to leave a gap between the stone face and the waterfall's curtain. She built it 3 feet high and 2 feet thick, dry stacked without mortar, which meant the fit of each stone against its neighbors had to carry the structural load on friction and weight rather than adhesion, which meant every stone required finding the right surface angle, the right mass distribution, the right neighboring stones to lock it in place. This was slower than mortar work, but produced a wall that settled into permanent stability under its own weight, a wall that would not crack when the freeze came because it had no rigid joints to fail. She left a 2-foot opening at the south end, the side where the waterfall spray was lightest, as her entrance. The opening was narrow enough to be inconspicuous from below, from the pool at the base of the falls. Looking up, the gap was invisible behind the angle of the south rock face, but wide enough to pass through sideways with the canvas sack, which she tested 3 times before she was satisfied. The thermal effect was immediate and significant. She felt it the evening she set the final course of the north section, standing inside the completed wall for the first time with the waterfall running its cold air curtain on the outer side. The mist that had been reaching the back third of the ledge was stopped entirely. The temperature inside the wall on the ledge itself was already measurably higher than the outside air. She estimated 8 to 10 degrees based on the feel against her face. The back wall's thermal mass was no longer being drained by the mist-cooled draft. It was holding what it had. The fireplace went in the next 3 days, built against the back wall's central section where the natural fissure at the ceiling joint was widest, giving the best updraft. She constructed the hearth from the flat river stones she had carried up from the creek deposit 40 yards at a time, 12 to 15 stones per trip balanced in the crook of her left arm, while her right hand managed the rock face beside the entrance. The fireback was stacked limestone 2 courses deep, angled slightly forward to throw heat into the room rather than up the fissure. She tested the draft before the first fire by holding a small, burning twist of dried grass near the fissure opening and watching the smoke move. It moved cleanly upward and then laterally through the fissure toward the hillside above. No backdraft, no spillage into the room. The fissure exited, she calculated, somewhere on the cliff face above and behind the overhang, a direction from which the smoke would dissipate into the hemlock canopy before it had traveled 50 feet laterally. This was the point at which she solved the problem that a younger, less experienced woman might have left unresolved smoke. May was not discovering fire management for the first time. She was 63, and she had spent more winters than she could precisely count managing the draw on a stone fireplace in a hollow that channeled wind in 6 directions depending on the season, and she understood smoke the way a river pilot understands current, as a force with consistent tendencies that rewards careful attention and punishes inattention without appeal. She established her fire protocol on the first night. She would burn only between 4 and 6 in the morning, when the hollow filled with the low-lying fog that the plateau produced on cold nights, as the ground temperature and the air temperature diverged. The fog was thickest in that 2-hour window, dense enough in October to obscure the far tree line from 20 feet away, and in that density, any smoke exiting the cliff face above would diffuse and disappear within yards of the exit point, becoming indistinguishable from the mist itself. She would bank the fire before 6, laying it deep with the hardest wood she could find, seasoned hickory from the deadfall on the slope above cherrywood. When she could find it, the densest fuel that would hold its heat the longest and require the least active burning during daylight hours. She would use the thermal mass of the back wall, which the morning fires built steadily over weeks, to maintain the room temperature through the day and into the night. By the third week of October, after 2 weeks of morning fires, the back wall's surface temperature had shifted from the baseline cave temperature she had measured by prolonged palm contact on the first night to something warmer. She estimated a 6-degree rise in surface temperature. Though she had no thermometer and was reading the change against the calibration of her own hand, which was an instrument she had reason to trust. The change was definite. The wall was absorbing the fire's heat into its mass and releasing it slowly over the hours and days. Between fires, the same principle as a soapstone stove, but operating at the scale of a cliff face with a thermal mass so vast that it would take weeks to saturate and months, possibly years, to fully express its potential. She was not heating a room. She was heating a mountain, and the mountain was heating her back. The sleeping platform went against the warmest section of the back wall on the north side of the fireplace, where the stone face had the most consistent temperature. She built it from flat slabs arranged in 2 tiers, a lower course as a foundation, an upper course as the sleeping surface, and covered it with dried hemlock boughs gathered from the slope. Above the boughs, layered shingle fashion with the thick end down so that they cushioned but also breathed, allowing the stone's warmth to rise through them. On the second trip to the Pikeville store, a full day's walk each way on the Ridge Trail, departure before first light, and return after dark, she bought a wool blanket for 60 cents and a coil of hemp rope for tying the storage shelf brackets she had planned for the south end of the wall. She arranged the remaining space with the consideration that a woman gives to a small room that must accomplish many things simultaneously without any one function impeding the others. The cooking area occupied the flat stone beside the fireplace on the south side, a granite-faced slab that she had identified on the slope above and carried down in sections, the 2 pieces fitting together at a slight angle that was more useful than a flat surface would have been because it allowed liquid to drain toward the front rather than pooling. The storage shelf at the south end of the back wall held her tin cup, her remaining food, her matches, and the spare dress folded into a rectangle that also served as additional insulation on the coldest nights when she placed it over the blanket's foot end. The water supply was the curtain itself reached by extending the tin cup through the entrance gap to the left, where the waterfall's edge provided a clean pour into the cup without requiring her to step through the curtain into the spray. She spent exactly 50 cents on materials in the first 6 weeks. Everything else was stone wood, dried grass, hemp from a stand of wild fiber plants on the slope above, and the labor of a woman who had discovered that the only reliable treatment for the specific grief she carried was to make something with her hands every single hour that the light permitted to keep the body moving in directed purpose, so that the mind did not have the stillness it required to revisit August 9th with the detailed, recursive attention that grief demands when it is not otherwise occupied. She was not better. She was not healing in the way that the word healing implies a linear recovery toward a previous state. She was building, and building was something different from healing, because healing assumes the goal is restoration, and building accepts that what comes next will not resemble what came before and is not supposed to. She laid stone and fitted stone and chinked the gaps with clay she carried from the creek bank in the fold of her skirt, and she did not think about Dale's coffee cup or the middle porch step or the tulip poplar shape of the field north of the cabin. And on the evenings when she could not stop thinking about these things, she thought about them directly, deliberately, the way you press on a bruise to establish its boundaries until she knew the exact edges of each memory and could contain it. January came to the Cumberland Plateau with the particular seriousness of a month that has decided to make its point. The temperature in the hollow dropped below 0 on the 3rd night of the new year, and May knew it was below 0 not from a thermometer, but from the sound the waterfall made when the mist at its edges began to freeze on the rocks, and the curtain itself thickened slightly, the water more reluctant in its fall, the sound deeper and slower. She had laid her fire at 4:30 that morning with cherry wood and a base of bone-dry hickory, banking it at 6 with a 6-inch bed of ash to hold the coals, and the room was 58 degrees by her hand's estimate when the temperature outside hit its lowest point in the mid-afternoon. But the cold that night worked on her joints in a way that temperature alone does not account for. It worked on the arthritis that had been living in her right hip since she was 55 and had never paid rent, but had extracted a considerable toll in the manner of a tenant who understands that the landlord cannot evict him. The hip began hurting at midnight, a deep interior pain that was not sharp but was structural, the kind of pain that cannot be rubbed out or walked off because it lives in the joint itself, and the joint is load-bearing and cannot rest while the body requires it to function. By 2 in the morning, she could not change position on the sleeping platform without a sustained effort that produced its own category of pain. And by 3, she understood that she was not going to sleep again that night and possibly not the next. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling, which was reflecting the deep-banked fire's glow in an amber pulse that was nearly imperceptible but was there, the stone-breathing light, the way it breathed heat slowly and completely. The waterfall was a black sound in the darkness, its white visible only at the very edges where the moonlight diffused through cloud caught the spray. She lay still because stillness was the one thing that did not cost her the hip's protest, and she thought about Dale, not around him, directly at him, the way she had been refusing to do since August 9th, letting herself look at the specific fact of him without flinching away before the full weight arrived. She thought about the way he had smelled in the mornings before the day's work had replaced his personal smell, with the outdoor smell, the particular warm-bred smell of a man who had slept well and risen without urgency, which was the smell of safety, and she knew that now because it was gone. She thought about the argument they had in the spring of 1879 over the drainage in the Southfield, an argument that had lasted 3 days and had been conducted entirely in the medium of deliberate silence and strategic relocation of objects, in the way of two people who have long since agreed that raised voices are not a language either of them wishes to speak. This was a smaller, more human grief, the kind that comes when the shock has finally finished its work and left behind only the permanent adjusted reality of absence, the new geography of a life with a person-shaped space in it that nothing else will ever fit exactly. She cried until she was done, which took about 20 minutes, and then she was done, and she lay in the amber glow of the banked fire and listened to the mountain breathe around her, its vast thermal patience entirely indifferent to the 20 minutes she had just spent, its warmth steady and continuing its offer unconditional. In the morning she got up. The hip was still bad but manageable, the way injuries are manageable when the alternative is not managing them. She rebuilt the fire from the banked coals, added cherrywood and hickory, and made her breakfast from the cornmeal that she mixed with water from the curtain edge and cooked on the flat granite stone over the fire's edge. She ate without appetite and then with appetite because the body is practical, and then she went to work on the project she had been planning for the past 2 weeks, which was the expansion of the storage shelf along the south wall. Grief does not pause for infrastructure. Infrastructure does not pause for grief. Both are true simultaneously, and the resolution is to keep building. Silas Pruitt found her on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of January. He found her not because he was looking for her in the way of a search party, not because anyone had sent him, not because he had seen smoke rising from the cliff face in the daylight hours. He found her because he was 72 years old, and he had been walking the hollows of the Cumberland Plateau before dawn for 50 years, following his nose toward ginseng and his eyes toward the particular ground disturbance that root-digging leaves in the forest floor. And because on that Tuesday morning in January, he was working the slope above the nameless creek when he smelled cherrywood smoke in the heavy pre-dawn fog. There was no cabin within 3 miles in that direction. He knew this the way he knew his own boot size, not by consulting a record, but by direct accumulated experience of the terrain. He had walked every hollow on this section of the plateau. He knew where every standing structure was and where every fallen one had been. The smell of cherry wood smoke at 5:30 in the morning in a hollow with no cabin and no clearing was a fact that required explanation. And Silas Pruitt was a man who had spent 50 years reading the forest's facts and following them to their source, because the forest did not produce meaningless signals, and the man who ignored its signals left ginseng in the ground. He followed the smell down the slope to the creek, then south along the creek to where it widened at the pool below the falls. He stood at the pool's edge in the beginning, and the fog was so thick that he could not see the waterfall clearly, only hear it and sense its presence in the way cold water displaces the air around it. He could smell the smoke more strongly, hear coming from above and behind the sound of the water, and he looked up into the fog and saw nothing. And then the pipe shifted in the slight morning breeze, and for 3 seconds the curtain of the waterfall was briefly visible through it. And behind the curtain, faint in the gray light, he saw the amber glow of banked coals. He climbed the rocks beside the falls with the slow, absolute confidence of a man who has not hurried in 40 years, because hurrying produces noise, and noise produces nothing worth having. He stepped through the curtain's edge and entered the room. May was at the cooking stone, her back to the entrance, adding water from the tin cup to the cornmeal mix. She heard him on the wet rocks. She always heard the rocks. It was one of the reasons she had kept the entrance. Where she did the approach was audible from 10 feet, and she turned with the tin cup in her hand, not startled, not afraid, but fully alert in the way of a woman who has been alone in a wilderness space for 3 months and has made her peace with the fact that aloneness is a temporary condition in a world full of living things that move. He stood in the entrance gap and looked at the room for a longer time, which she allowed because she recognized immediately the quality of his looking, not invasive, not proprietary, not the look of a man calculating what advantage the situation offered him, but the look of a man who genuinely does not understand what he is seeing and is honest enough to take the time to actually see it before he says anything about it. His face was the face of a man who had spent 72 years outdoors, which is to say it was the color and texture of old saddle leather and organized around the eyes in a way that made those eyes the most prominent feature. Pale blue fixed on close detail for so long that they seemed to focus slightly nearer than other people's eyes, as though the world's relevant information was always approximately 14 inches away. He had a beard that was entirely white and stained at the corners with tobacco, and he wore a canvas coat that had been patched in 4 places with different materials, which told her more about him in the first 5 seconds than an hour of conversation would have. He said, "How long?" She said, "Since October." He said, "You warm enough?" And she put her hand flat against the back wall, the wall that had been receiving her morning fires for 3 months and had in its vast stone patience absorbed and stored, and was now radiating back at a surface temperature she estimated at 60 degrees, and she said, "Feel." He crossed the room without invitation or hesitation and pressed his palm to the limestone. He held it there for a long time, the way a person holds still when they have encountered something that requires the full attention of the body rather than just the mind. The wall was warm, the way a living body is warm, not from a proximate source, but from deep within itself. Warmth with mass behind it, warmth that had been deposited over time and would remain after the fire was cold. He stood with his palm against the stone and his pale eyes looking at nothing in particular, and then he said, "The mountain's warming you." May said, "I'm warming the mountain. It's warming me back." He nodded once. Not the nod of a person who is agreeing with a sentiment, but the nod of a person who has just received information that reorganizes other information they already possessed, a structural nod, the kind that means the category has changed. Then he sat down on the stone she had positioned near the fire as a working seat, not invited, not uninvited, simply finding the place in the room that made most sense for a person who intended to stay briefly, and he told her what she had not known he was going to tell her. Curtis had been to Pikeville in November, not to the farm, which was already in the process of transferring to the neighbor who had purchased it, but to the Pikeville store and to the Methodist church and to the courthouse, where he had some acquaintance with the county clerk. He had asked about his mother in the quiet, methodical way of a courthouse man, gathering information, not frantically, not visibly distressed, but with the organized persistence of someone who has decided that information is available and intends to collect it. Silas had been at the store the second day of Curtis's visit, and he had heard the questions, and he had been introduced by the storekeeper as a man who knew the plateau's hollows better than anyone, and Curtis had turned his courthouse attention on Silas and asked whether he had seen an older woman, 63, gray-brown hair, blue eyes, traveling alone on the ridge trails. Silas had said he had not. This was a lie because Silas had not seen May, but he had 2 weeks before Curtis arrived in Pikeville found the entrance footprints at the base of the falls during a wet week when the clay around the pool held impressions, and he had known from the size and depth and gait pattern of the prints that they belonged to a woman traveling alone with a loaded pack, and he had known from their direction and their purpose, the way they crossed and recrossed the pool rocks, the way they climbed the cliff face beside the falls, that whoever had made them had gone behind the waterfall and not come back out, which meant she was still in there. He had known all of this and had said nothing to Curtis and had said, "I have not seen a woman traveling alone on the ridge trails." He explained none of this calculation to May that morning. He simply told her what had happened, the facts of it, and she absorbed the facts and understood the rest from the way he delivered them without apology or justification, the way a man reports an action he has taken and has no need to defend. She understood that this required a response from her that acknowledged the full weight of what he had done. He had lied to her son. He had done it without knowing her, without any conversation or agreement, on the basis of a set of footprints and a correct inference about what those footprints meant. He had taken on the moral cost of the lie without being asked to carry it, which meant he had an opinion about whether she should be here that preceded any knowledge of her, an opinion formed entirely from evidence. And the evidence had told him something about her situation that he had chosen to respect before he had ever met her. She said, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire rather than at her, and then he said, "I had a wife, Matilda. She was 68 and she was sound in her body and her mind, and she could have lived 10 more years easy. My son took her to the Methodist home in Pikeville in the winter of '89. She died the following October." He paused. "The room she died in had a window that looked at a fence. I don't think she saw a single tree the whole last year of her life. The room held that information without requiring anything further from either of them." He came back the following Tuesday and the Tuesday after that, and his visits established themselves as the rhythm against which May measured the weeks in the absence of any other calendar. He never stayed longer than an hour. He never asked about the hollow she had left, or about Curtis, or about what she intended to do in the longer term, because he was a man who had learned in 72 years that asking people about their intentions is a form of pressure dressed as curiosity, and pressure was not something he had any interest in applying. He brought small things on his visits, presented without ceremony: a sack of cornmeal, a jar of dark honey from a hive he kept on the slope above his cabin, 3 hollows north, a cast iron skillet that he claimed to have found, but that May could see from the unworn handle, and the unscratched interior was new, bought at the Pikeville hardware, which meant he had carried it a long way on a Tuesday for a woman he had known for 3 weeks. She said nothing about this. Acceptance was the correct response when a person offered dignity in the form of a useful object, and requiring them to account for the gift would reduce it to something smaller than it was. He sat on the working stone and drank a cup of water from the curtain, and sometimes said things and sometimes said nothing, and she worked or sat depending on what the day required, and his presence was the kind that does not demand accommodation. The second Tuesday, he brought a small calendar, a printed paper one from the hardware store, the kind given away to customers in December. He set it on the storage shelf without comment. She picked it up, turned through the pages, looked at the remaining months of 1898 printed in their neat grids, and set it back down on the shelf with its face to the wall. His voice was even when he said, "So you'll know where you are." Her voice was quieter than she expected when she said, "I know exactly where I am for the first time in 40 years. I don't need a calendar to tell me." He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression changed in a way that was not pity and was not admiration, but was recognition, the specific recognition of one person who has arrived by a different route at the same understanding. He nodded his structural nod, picked up his cup, drank the last of his water, and set the cup down. He did not move the calendar, and she did not move it, and it sat with its face to the wall for the rest of the winter, which was its own kind of answer. Spring came in March in the way of the plateau springs. Not gently, not with the textbook sequence of warming temperatures and budding trees, but in the combative fashion of a season that has been in negotiation with winter for weeks and has finally won the argument on a specific day, so that on a Tuesday the hollow is still locked in gray cold, and on a Thursday the dogwoods on the south-facing slopes are white, and the air smells of wet earth and something cellular, and determined in every living thing is responding to a signal that has no name in any human language, but is understood by everything else. The increased snowmelt swelled the waterfall. By mid-March, the curtain was twice its October volume, the sound filling the hollow from ridge to ridge, the mist heavier and carrying further. May raised the front wall by 14 inches, adding 2 new courses of flat stone that angled slightly inward at the top, deflecting the heavier spray upward rather than letting it crest over. She sealed the wall face with a clay slurry she mixed to the consistency of heavy cream and applied with a flat river stone as a trowel, smoothing it into the gaps between courses and over the surface where it dried to a pale gray shell that shed water rather than absorbing it. The clay work took 4 days, and she had to repeat the top course after the first heavy rain washed it back off, which was information about clay concentration that she filed and applied to the second application, getting the ratio right through the direct instruction of failure rather than through deliberation. The garden terrace occupied her attention through April. There was a natural flat bench on the south-facing slope above the cliff, a section of mountain soil that had collected in the angle between the cliff face and the hillside above it, 12 feet wide and 8 feet deep, oriented to receive 6 hours of direct sun in the growing season because of the way the hollow opened to the south, and the cliff behind the bench reflected additional warmth into the growing space the way a south-facing wall does in a kitchen garden, compounding the sun's effect. She cleared it of the ground cover and the small rocks that winter frost had heaved to the surface, breaking up the clay-heavy soil with a pointed stake of hickory that she sharpened on the cliff face and drove repeatedly into the compacted earth until it opened then, working in handfuls of creek sand carried up from the deposit at the ford to improve the drainage. She built a low border of flat stones on the downhill edge to hold the soil during heavy rain. She walked to the Pikeville store and spent 60 cents on bean seed, squash seed, and seed potatoes, which she carried back in the canvas sack with her food supplies, arriving at the Waterfall Hollow after dark, navigating the last 2 miles by feel and star position, and the sound of the waterfall growing in the dark as she descended the slope. The first bean seedlings pushed through the soil in early May, and she felt watching them the emotion she had not been able to name since October, which she now understood was not joy precisely but its functional equivalent in a person who has moved past the need for joy to mean happiness, and arrived at the understanding that it can also mean continuation is worthwhile. The small green cotyledons emerging from the dark soil were not metaphors. They were beans. But they were beans that required her attention and her water and her knowledge of when to thin and when to side dress and when to watch for beetles. And in requiring these things, they gave her days a structure that was not imposed from outside but grew from the work itself, organic and self-sustaining. Silas brought the hens in the 3rd week of April, carrying them in a wooden crate on his back up the ridge trail, a journey of several miles each way that he undertook without comment. He set the crate down on the terrace and lifted the door, and the 2 hens stepped out with the particular dignity of chickens who have decided to interpret every situation as satisfactory, regardless of evidence. And May watched them begin immediately working the terrace soil for insects with the focused efficiency of animals that have no capacity for confusion about their purpose. He said, "I'm too old to keep chickens properly. They need a younger operation." She looked at him. He was 72, lean as fence post wire, with a particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have done physical work their entire lives and have never wasted a gesture. He had kept chickens for 40 years. She said, "You've kept chickens for 40 years, Silas." He said, "I've kept them badly 40 years. You'll do it right." This was a fiction they both understood as generosity offered in the form of practical information, and she accepted it as such, which was the only way a person like May Calloway could accept something she had not earned and would not otherwise take. She built the coop on the slope beside the waterfall, under a limestone overhang that provided a natural roof walling the sides with rhododendron branches woven as dense as basketwork, the gaps too small for a fox to assess as worth the effort. She lined the floor with dry hemlock boughs, changed weekly. The hens produced reliably beginning in May, 2 eggs most mornings, and the eggs changed her diet in ways that registered immediately in her energy levels and the steadiness of her hands during the fine work of clay application and stone fitting. She was 63, and she was doing the physical work of a person considerably younger, and her body made its requirements known with specificity. Curtis came back to Pikeville in May. She did not know this until Silas told her the following Tuesday, and Silas told her with a directness that meant he understood she needed the information unmodified. Curtis had come on the train, had stayed 2 nights at the Pikeville Hotel, and had hired a man named Garrett Stiles as a guide. Garrett knew the plateau trails well enough for a casual walk, but not well enough to know which hollows a person might choose for concealment and why. Curtis had described his mother in the Pikeville store and at the Methodist church, and he had asked whether anyone had seen a woman of her description moving along the ridge trails in the past 9 months. He had spoken to Silas in the hardware store on the second day. Silas looked at his hands when he reached this part, the large rope-scarred hands of a man who has done his life's work with them and carries in them a record of that work, and he said, he asked me again, same question. Had I seen an older woman, blue eyes, traveling alone? He paused, his eyes on his hands. I told him I had not. May sat with this for a moment. The lie was larger now because it was a second lie to the same person, which means it is no longer a single act but a decision repeated, a position held. She looked at Silas, at the particular weight he was carrying, in the way his shoulders held the information. Not collapsed under it, but not easy either. And she understood something about this man that she had been understanding incrementally since January, and was now understanding completely. He was not protecting her out of a generalized sympathy for independent women or a general disapproval of families. He was protecting her out of the specific personal unhealed guilt of a man who had failed to protect someone else in a situation he recognized in this one, and the protection he was offering now was the only form of repair available to him for a thing that could not actually be repaired. She said, he'll come back. Silas said, yes. She said, will you lie a third time? He was quiet for long enough that the waterfall filled the silence completely, and then he said, I expect I will. She looked at the waterfall as heavy late spring volume, white and continuous, and she thought about Curtis in the Pikeville Hotel, a 38-year-old man in a purchased coat asking questions in a courthouse voice about a woman who did not want to be found, and she felt for him something complicated and true. Not anger, not the residue of the scene with the Methodist home letterhead, but the particular sadness of a mother who can see clearly both what her child is doing wrong and why he is doing it, and who knows that the knowledge cannot be given, only arrived at. She said nothing more about it. Silas finished his water and left. She went back to the terrace and the beans, which needed tying to the stakes she had driven along the border, and she tied them with the hemp cords she cut from the coil on the storage shelf, methodical hands moving in the familiar pattern, and she did not allow herself to think about Curtis in the hotel room, arranging for yet another Pikeville visit, because there was nothing she could do about that from here, except continue to be here, which was what she intended. The flood came on the 12th of June. The thunderstorm had been building since noon, the clouds massing over the plateau's western edge in the way of serious summer storms, not the quick-moving cells that drop, rain, and pass, but the stationary systems that park over a ridge and release their entire accumulation in one sustained pour. By 3 in the afternoon, the rain was coming down in curtains, not individual drops distinguishable from one another, but a continuous transfer of water from cloud to earth, and the hollow below the waterfall, which channeled runoff from 200 acres of ridge slope, above it began to fill in the way a vessel fills when the inflow rate exceeds the drainage rate. May heard the change in the waterfall's voice before she saw the water rising. The pitch dropped, and the volume increased, and the sound became less a waterfall and more a general condition of the atmosphere surrounding rather than directional, and she understood what was coming and moved to the storage shelf and began lifting items to the highest positions, relocating the cornmeal, the dried beans, the tobacco tin of matches, the canvas sack with her money in it, stacking them on the upper course of the storage shelf, and then packing the most irreplaceable items into the sack itself and hanging the sack from a hickory peg she had driven into a crack in the back wall the previous month for exactly this kind of contingency. The surge came over the ledge in a brown wave that crested the front wall's gap, and the top course simultaneously spreading across the floor to 6 inches in 2 minutes, and then continuing to rise before the drainage rate caught up and stabilized it. 6 inches of fast-moving cold water on a limestone floor. The fire drowned in 40 seconds. The sleeping platform boughs scattered. 2 of the cooking stones floated free of their positions and carried through the entrance gap into the pool below. She was standing on the sleeping platform's stone base, which was above the waterline, reaching for the sack on the wall peg, when the floor shifted under the water. Not the floor itself, but a coating of algae on the wet stone that the waterfall spray had been slowly colonizing for 11 months, invisible when dry, frictionless when wet and submerged. Her right foot went lateral without warning, and she had nothing to catch on because her hands were on the sack. She came down on her left side, her left hip, taking the impact on stone, and her right ankle turned under her in a direction it was not designed to accommodate, and the pain was immediate and specific and informative. The sharp, narrow pain of a joint forced past its range of motion, which is different from the blunt pain of a bruise and leaves no ambiguity about what has happened. She lay still in 6 inches of cold, moving water for a moment, making the assessment that the circumstances required, which was left hip impact painful, no structural failure, right ankle significant, potentially compromised, ability to stand unknown but necessary to determine. She got her hands under her on the submerged floor and pushed up, finding her feet carefully, and stood with most of her weight on the left leg while the ankle's actual condition declared itself. It declared itself as bad but not catastrophic. Weight-bearing with pain stable with support, which was worse than nothing but considerably better than the alternative. The water level was already dropping. The drainage had caught up with the inflow as the storm's peak passed, and she stood in diminishing water on the stone platform and looked at the room, at the scattered boughs, and the displaced cooking stones, and the dead fire, and the 6 inches of brown water still draining through the front gap, and she felt something clarify in her chest that was not despair and was not denial, but was the practical lucidity of a person who has just had everything taken apart and is already calculating which piece to rebuild first. She rebuilt in 2 days. The ankle she splinted with 2 straight hickory sticks and a length of hemp cord, wrapping it in a figure 8 that stabilized the joint without cutting off circulation, a technique she had used on cattle twice and on herself once before on the same ankle, on the cellar steps, which suggested that the ankle had a particular philosophy about direction of travel that she needed to continue to account for. She collected the scattered hearthstones from the pool below by wading in barefoot. The cold water was actually useful on the swelling, and replaced them in their positions. She cut fresh hemlock boughs from the slope above and relaid the sleeping platform. She rebuilt the fire with the matches from the tobacco tin that the sack had protected, and she lay in the rebuilt space that evening and listened to the waterfall running its normal June volume, and felt the back wall's stored heat diminished by 2 days without fires but not erased, still present at the surface, patient and unhurried. When Silas came the following Tuesday and saw the way she moved across the room, the careful redistribution of weight, the slight hitch in the step, the way she placed the right foot, with a deliberateness that was not her normal economy of movement, he looked at her for a long moment from the entrance gap before he said anything. She had not told him about the flood. He had seen the high water mark on the pool rocks and understood what had happened. He crossed the room and sat on the working stone and drank his water and watched her move, and then he said, "You need someone closer." She turned from the storage shelf where she had been rearranging the dried goods that the flood had displaced and looked at him, this 72-year-old man, with his patched coat and his 50 years of hollow walking and his white beard, and she said, "Are you offering to move in, Silas?" The room was quiet except for the waterfall. He looked at her over the cup. She looked at him. And then in the same moment, without coordination or intention, they both began to laugh. The real laughter of people who have found something genuinely unexpected, and the sound of it went into the room and into the waterfall's continuous voice, and the room held it the way it held the fire's heat, adding it to everything else it had been given, returning it over time in warmth. The laughter ended, but the warmth remained. And outside on the slope below the hollow, Orson Tate's cattle had wandered to the creek bottom during the flood, and Orson had followed them, and Orson had seen the hearthstones scattered in the pool, and Orson had looked up at the waterfall and seen through the thin June curtain the shadow of a stone wall where no wall had any natural business being. And Orson Tate, being a man of the plateau's particular communicative traditions, had already told his wife. And his wife had not yet decided who to tell next, but she had 3 conversations she intended to have before Sunday. Orson Tate's wife was named Beulah, and Beulah was not a gossip in the way the word is usually meant, which implies a pleasure in the circulation of information for its own sake. She was something more purposeful than that, a woman who understood that in a mountain community where people lived miles apart and saw each other principally at church and at the store. The movement of information was a form of infrastructure it is necessary to the community's functioning as the roads and as carefully maintained. She told the women of the Pikeville Methodist Church on a Wednesday, which was choir practice, and she told them not with relish, but with the gravity appropriate to a situation she did not fully understand and therefore could not evaluate. A widow woman living behind a waterfall in a cave in the Cumberland Hollow, alone, since October of the previous year. The women of the choir process this in the way that women who have spent their lives managing complex social situations process new information quickly with multiple simultaneous evaluations running in parallel. Some of them compassionate and some of them alarmed, and some of them simply curious in the straightforward way of people whose lives do not contain enough novelty. By Sunday, the information had reached the preacher, whose name was Dobbins, Gerald Dobbins, 34 years old, from a family in Crossville who had sent him to the seminary in Nashville with the particular expectation of families that invest in a son's education, which is that the investment will produce returns in the form of status and influence. He was earnest in his faith, which was genuine, and ambitious in his position, which was also genuine. And these two things lived together in him in an uneasy arrangement that he had never examined carefully enough to understand how they complicated each other. He knew about the Waterfall Hollow. He knew because a man named Raymond Calhoun, who held the deed to 300 acres on the plateau's southern edge that included the hollow and the cliff face in the stream below, it had been in conversation with Dobbins for 4 months about the possibility of selling the timber rights to a logging operation out of Chattanooga. The old-growth hemlock on that slope was worth considerable money to the right buyer, and Raymond Calhoun was a man who measured the worth of a thing by its conversion rate to currency, and the hollow's timber he had estimated with the logging company's surveyor converted at a rate that would pay off his existing debts and leave him comfortable for several years. The obstacle, minor but real, was that a person living on the land, even without legal claim to it, created a complication. Not a legal one necessarily, but the kind of social and reputational complication that Raymond Calhoun wanted resolved before the paperwork moved forward. Dobbins had been asked quietly over a supper at the Calhoun house in July whether he might not make a pastoral visit to the woman in the waterfall, in a purely spiritual capacity, of course, to assess her situation and, if possible, to encourage her toward a more suitable arrangement. Calhoun had not said the words timber rights in this conversation. He had said words like welfare and community and Christian concern. Dobbins had heard the other words underneath these words, the way a person with musical training hears the harmonic structure beneath the melody, and he had agreed to make the visit because agreement was easier than the alternative, and because he told himself, as people do when they agree to carry someone else's purpose inside their own, that his motives were primarily pastoral and the other thing was secondary. He rode to the Waterfall Hollow on a Thursday in July on a horse that managed the Ridge Trail with the resignation of an animal that has been asked to do this kind of thing before and has decided that objection is less efficient than compliance. He tied the horse at the tree line above the hollow and descended on foot to the falls. The waterfall in July was returning toward its lower late summer volume, the curtain thinning, and he could see through it the shadow of the stone wall, and above the wall a faint architectural order that was not natural, the deliberate linearity of built things visible even through moving water. He climbed the rocks beside the falls. He stepped through the curtain's edge. He stood in the entrance gap of the room and said nothing for what was, for a man who earned his living with prepared words, an unusually long time. May was on the terrace above the cliff when she heard him on the rocks, and she came down the path that she had worn along the cliff face in 9 months of daily ascending and descending, a path now as defined as a deer trail, her feet finding it without deliberation. She came around the corner of the cliff face and found him standing in her doorway, and she read him in the same practiced second she had been reading strangers her entire adult life. The good coat, too good for a trail ride, worn for effect. The youth of his face in conflict with the authority he was attempting to project with his posture. The slight contraction around his eyes when he saw her, that meant he had built a picture of what he was coming to find, and the reality was not matching it. She invited him in because hospitality was not something she had left behind when she left the cabin. It was structural, not situational. You offered what you had to a person at your threshold, regardless of why they had come, and you allowed the what you had to make its own argument. He entered the room and stood in the center of it and turned slowly, taking it in. And what he took in was not a cave. The wall across the front ran true and solid, its clay-sealed face smooth and pale in the waterfall's filtered light. The sleeping platform against the back wall was neat. The wool blanket folded the hemlock boughs fresh and aromatic beneath it. The fire was laid in the hearth with the careful geometry of a woman who has learned the exact arrangement that catches fastest and burns longest, and above the hearth the feaster drew the air in a slow, continuous exhale. The cooking area was organized with the precision of a space where every object has been used enough times to find its permanent location. The storage shelf held its contents in the ordered arrangement of a pantry rather than a cache. The dried goods in their cloth bags, the tobacco tin with the matches, the tools arranged by frequency of use. On the south wall at a height she could reach comfortably, a row of hickory pegs held her spare dress, her shawl, and a length of rope she used for the garden ties. The floor was swept limestone, clean and dry. Above it all, the waterfall threw its moving light across the ceiling in a continuous shifting wash of green and amber that transformed the raw stone into something that had no accurate category in domestic architecture. The prepared speech did not survive its first contact with the room. She watched it fail in him. Watched the organized progression of his argument dissolve in the face of what the room actually was, rather than what he had imagined it would be: the damp cave, the huddled widow, the rescue scenario he had composed and rehearsed and brought a long way on a horse to deliver. She gave him time to process the dissolution, because rushing a person through the collapse of their preconceptions produces defensiveness rather than understanding. And she wanted him to understand. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, this is not what I expected." She said, "What did you expect?" He was honest enough in the end to answer honestly. He said he had expected misery. He said he had expected to find a woman in a condition that required intervention, spiritual and practical, someone whose situation would confirm the concern he had been sent to deliver. He said this with the candor of a young man who has not yet perfected the social skill of concealing the gap between his stated purpose and his actual one, and she respected the candor even as she understood what it revealed about the unstated purpose behind it. She looked at him steadily, this small woman with the brown hair now considerably more silver than it had been in October, pulled back from a face that the months had refined rather than diminished. The lines around her eyes deepened by months of outdoor light, but the eyes themselves clearer than they had been in the weeks after Dale's death. The blue of them sharpened rather than dulled by what the year had required. She was 63 years old, and she had managed 42 years of a working farm and 1 year of a stone room behind a waterfall, and she was not confused about which of these had been harder. She said, "Preacher Dobbins, I know why Raymond Calhoun sent you here, and I know it wasn't for my soul." His face changed in the way of a person who has been accurately read and has no prepared response for accuracy. She continued before he could reconstruct his position. "I have no legal claim to this ledge. I know that. I live here at the tolerance of whoever holds the deed to this hillside. If Raymond Calhoun wants to cut his timber, I cannot stop him, and I have no intention of trying." She paused, letting this settle, and then, "But I want you to understand something before you carry your report back to him. I want you to understand it, not him, because you're the one standing in my room and you have eyes." She gestured a single contained movement that encompassed the room, the waterfall, the ceiling, with its shifting light. "Tell me honestly, as a man of God, and not as Raymond Calhoun's errand, whether what you see here looks like something that needed rescuing." He looked. He took the full, slow look, the same one he had taken when he first entered, but this time without the scaffolding of his prepared narrative to organize it. He looked at the wall and the fire and the sleeping platform and the waterfall casting its light through the moving water, and something in the room reached him in a way he had not anticipated, the way warmth reaches a person who has been cold for a long time and did not realize until the sensation arrived how much they had been missing it. He pressed his palm briefly to the back wall, not the sustained communion that Silas had made of it, but the instinctive touch of a man in the presence of something he cannot immediately explain. And the warmth passed through his hand and rearranged something behind his eyes. He stood with his hand against the stone, and his prepared speech fully dissolved, and then he said something that she had not expected from him, which was the truth. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, I am 34 years old and I have a parsonage in Pikeville that my congregation considers adequate. It has 4 rooms and 2 fireplaces. It is cold every winter from November through March because the walls are thin and the fireplaces pull heat out faster than the wood puts it in. He looked at his hand on the stone. This wall is warmer than my parsonage in July. She said, I built it that way. He left without mentioning Raymond Calhoun again, and the story he told in Pikeville was not the story he had ridden out to collect. It was the story of a room that was warmer than his parsonage, and this detail specific and verifiable, and entirely devoid of the pity or alarm that would have made it dismissible, traveled through the hollows, the way all true things travel in mountain communities, slowly without embellishment, arriving at each new listener in essentially the same form it had left the previous one, because the people of the Cumberland Plateau had long ago developed an instinctive resistance to narrative inflation. They had enough actual things happen to them that they did not need to improve on the facts, and the fact of a 63-year-old widow who had built a warm room behind a waterfall and lived there alone for 9 months required no improvement. Raymond Calhoun's timber deal moved forward the following spring. He sold the rights to the hemlock on the upper slope, which the logging company accessed from the ridge above, and the hollow itself, the cliff face, the ledge, the waterfall, the pool lay below the timberline and was not part of the contract. Whether this was a deliberate exclusion or a coincidence of geography, she never determined and did not pursue. The hemlock on the upper slope came down over 2 weeks in April, and she could hear the axes and the falling trees from the ledge, the sounds carrying down the hollow in the still morning air. And she sat with the sounds and felt the complicated mix of grief and relief that comes from losing something and not losing something else. And she continued her morning fire and her garden work and her Tuesday anticipation of Silas's boots on the wet rocks, and the hollow adjusted as hollows do to the new silence where the old-growth trees had been. Silas Pruitt died in the second week of January in the year 1900, in the third winter of May's residency at the Waterfall. He died in his own cabin, 3 hollows north, alone in his sleep, which was the death he would have chosen if he had been offered the selection, because he was a man who had no patience for slow endings and had said so to May the previous autumn with the frankness of a 73-year-old who has no remaining social incentive for indirection. He had said, I intend to die in my own bed before I become a person who requires managing. And she had said, I'll hold you to that. And he had looked at her and said, you will be the one at the grave most likely. I don't have anyone else who'd bother. She had not argued with this because it was accurate, and because arguing with accurate statements as a form of comfort had always seemed to her a peculiar form of disrespect. The neighbor who found him sent word to Pikeville, and the word reached May through the storekeeper on her next supply trip 3 days after Silas had been buried in the churchyard with the Methodist preacher presiding over a congregation of 6 people, which the storekeeper reported with the mild apologetic tone of someone delivering information they know is insufficient to the loss. She walked back to the Waterfall Hollow from Pikeville in the January cold, with the weight of it, not the dramatic weight of a new grief. She had used up a considerable portion of her capacity for acute grief in the year following Dale's death, but the quieter weight of the specific absence of a specific person, the particular silence that opens in a life when someone who filled a particular space in it is no longer there to fill it. She kept his Tuesday. She went on Tuesdays to the flat rock above the pool, where he had sometimes sat when the weather allowed him to wait outside before climbing to the ledge, and she brought her tin cup and she sat on the rock and drank a cup of water from the curtain and looked at the hollow and said nothing, because Silas had been a man who understood that the highest form of company is the kind that requires nothing of you, and she honored this understanding by continuing it into his absence. She did this every Tuesday for the rest of the year, and then less regularly in subsequent years, but she never stopped entirely, and the flat rock above the pool remained in her private geography of the hollow Silas's rock, the way that particular places remain associated with particular people long after both the person and the association have ceased to be verifiable facts and have become instead a matter of felt truth. The winter of the third year was also the winter in which she finally understood what she was building, not in the material sense, the material project she had understood from the first morning, the wall and the hearth and the garden and the coop, but in the other sense, the interior one, the sense in which a life is a construction that proceeds from decision to decision, each one narrowing the range of subsequent decisions, the way each stone placed narrows the range of the next stone's position. She had made the decision at the Waterfall in September 1897. Every subsequent decision had been implicit in that first one. The garden and the chickens and the clay work and the Tuesday calendar of Silas's visits. She was not surviving. She was not waiting for something to change. She was not healing toward a point at which she would re-enter the world she had left. She was building a life that was the life, the terminal construction, the one that would not be followed by another. She was 66 years old, and she had, by her own rough estimate, 20 years left if her constitution held, and she intended to spend them here watching the waterfall change its character through the seasons, maintaining the back wall's temperature with her morning fires, growing beans and squash and potatoes on the south-facing terrace, and inhabiting the particular freedom of a person who has resolved the question of what she wants and found that what she wants is available and requires no one's permission. The fifth year brought pneumonia. It came in February, the way pneumonia comes to people who live in close contact with the outdoors in wet weather. Not suddenly, but in the accumulating way of a siege, first the heaviness in the chest that she attributed to the cold air coming off the waterfall, then the cough that woke her from sleep with its productive depth, then the fever that she monitored by the specific quality of her thinking, which became unreliable in the way that fever thinking becomes unreliable. The thoughts still arriving, but arriving at wrong angles, not quite connecting to each other in the logical sequence that her mind normally maintained with the precision of a well-run household. She lay on the sleeping platform for 3 days drinking water from the curtain in the tin cup she could just reach from horizontal feeding the fire with the wood she had stacked within reach of the platform in November, specifically against the possibility of a winter illness, because a 68-year-old woman who lives alone in a stone room makes provision for the obvious eventualities. The fever peaked on the third night at a level that she recognized even in her compromised state as significant. She lay in the fire's glow with the sweat soaking through her dress and the back wall radiating its steady warmth against her back, and she thought with the clarity that sometimes comes at the height of fever when the mind has burned through all the dross and reached the structural material underneath that she was not afraid of dying here. She was not ready to die here. These were different things, and knowing the difference was the work of a year that had begun with a woman who was not sure she was afraid of dying and had ended with one who was fairly certain she preferred to continue. On the fourth morning, the fever broke. She lay in the damp of the breaking fever and understood that she needed help, which was not a conclusion she reached easily or without resistance, but which she reached accurately because pneumonia at 68 in a stone room, accessible only by climbing wet rocks, was not a situation that pride could resolve. She packed nothing. She dressed in the warmest clothes she had, wrapped her shawl over her coat, and walked out of the room and down the cliff rocks and along the creek trail and up to the ridge trail and north toward Pikeville, 12 miles, which took her 6 hours at the pace that a woman with a chest infection and 3 days of reduced food intake can maintain over a ridge trail in February. Curtis was not in Pikeville. She had known he would not be because Curtis's life was in Chattanooga, and she had never expected it to be otherwise. She went to the Pikeville store and spoke to the storekeeper, who was a man named Hadley, and Hadley's wife brought her into the back room and fed her cornbread and broth and sent for the doctor, who came in the afternoon and listened to her chest and said the words she had already diagnosed herself and gave her a packet of the medication that was available for it and told her to rest for 2 weeks and not to go back into the cold until the cough had resolved. She rested for 4 days at Hadley's wife's insistence, sleeping in the storeroom on a folded quilt that was softer than the sleeping platform, but lacked the back wall's radiant warmth, which she missed with an immediacy that surprised her the way you miss a specific thing rather than a category of things. On the 5th day, she wrote to Curtis. Not to tell him she was ill, she did not tell him she had been ill, but to give him, for the first time in 5 years, a way to reach her. She wrote the letter in the Hadley store's back room with a borrowed pen and told him that a letter addressed to May Calloway, care of Hadley's General Merchandise, Pikeville, Tennessee, would find her when she came into town for supplies, which she did on a regular basis. She did not explain where she lived. She did not invite a visit. She gave him the postal address as a practical fact, the way she had always communicated with him, in the medium of useful information, stripped of the emotional freight that both of them found difficult to carry in each other's presence. She walked back to the waterfall on the 5th day against the doctor's advice and with the medication in her coat pocket, and she descended the hollow and climbed the rocks and stepped through the curtain into the room that had maintained itself in her absence. The banked fire still holding coals after 5 days because she had laid it deep before she left the back wall, holding its temperature because it was no longer being managed. But it did not need management. It needed only to be left alone to do what 5 years of morning fires had established as its permanent condition. She sat on the sleeping platform and breathed the room's air and felt the wall's warmth against her back and was home in the way that the word home means when it has been earned rather than assigned. Curtis wrote back in 3 weeks. The letter was longer than his quarterly letters, which was notable, and it was written in a different cadence than his usual courthouse prose, the careful, sequenced cadence of a man who has been sitting with something for a long time and is choosing his words with more care than the transmission of information requires, because the thing he is actually transmitting is not information. He wrote that he was relieved to have an address for her. He wrote that he had tried to find her in Pikeville along the ridge trails through every contact he had in the county and had failed each time, and had eventually decided in the way that the courthouse teaches a man to decide when evidence is insufficient that his mother was alive because the evidence of her death was also absent, and absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. He wrote that he thought about the morning he had put the Methodist home letterhead on the kitchen table, and that he thought about it the way he thought about cases in which he had made a procedural error, which was to say with the specific discomfort of a man who cannot undo the error, but cannot stop knowing it was one. He did not write the word sorry. He wrote around it the same way she and Dale had always written around the things that were true but difficult, and she read around his writing and found it there. She wrote back. She did not tell him where she lived. She told him she was well and that she had a garden that produced reliably and chickens that had multiplied to 4 over 5 years, and that the mountain she lived in was warmer than any house she had ever inhabited. She told him this last thing because she wanted him to know it was true, not because she expected him to understand it. Understanding required being in the room. The 7th year brought the girl. Her name was Nora Spence, and she was 19 years old, and she arrived at the Waterfall Hollow on a Tuesday in May, moving at the speed of a person who is not hiking, but fleeing, her dress torn at the sleeve, and her hair loose and her face carrying the particular blankness of a person who has very recently made a decision that has not yet become entirely real to them. She found the waterfall the way May had found it, by sound, following it down the slope through the rhododendron, arriving at the pool's edge, and standing there breathing hard with her hands on her knees. May was on the terrace above when she heard the girl's approach, and she came down the cliff path and stood at the pool's edge across the water from her and looked at her, assessing with the same rapid accuracy she had turned on Preacher Dobbins and on Silas Pruitt and on every other person who had arrived at the threshold of her life, asking for something they had not yet found the words for. The girl looked up. She looked at May. She looked at the waterfall. She looked at the cliff face. She had the instinct of a person in genuine extremity, which is not to think, but to go toward the thing that looks like shelter, and she went toward it without being invited, climbing the wet rocks without hesitation, stepping through the curtain into the room. May followed her in. She did not ask what had happened. She had been asked enough questions in her life by people who wanted answers they were not going to do anything useful with, and she had decided early in the Waterfall years that questions were a form of transaction, and she had no interest in transactions she could not honor. She put the fire on. She made cornmeal porridge in the cast-iron skillet Silas had brought, the handle still unworn after 7 years, which was its own kind of presence, and she handed the bowl to the girl, and the girl ate with the concentrated attention of someone who has not eaten since the previous day. The girl stayed 3 weeks. She slept on the sleeping platform, and May slept on the stone beside the fire with her shawl and the spare dress over her, which was not comfortable, but was adequate, and she woke before dawn each morning to build the fire and make the breakfast and carry on the daily work of the garden and the chickens, with the girl sometimes beside her and sometimes sitting at the pool's edge watching the waterfall, and sometimes simply absent in the particular interior way of a person working through a decision that no one else can assist. She left on a Tuesday, the day after May's Tuesday of sitting at Silas's rock. She packed nothing because she had arrived with nothing. She said, "I don't know how to thank you," and May said, "Go somewhere true," which was not the advice she had planned to give, but was the advice that came out, and the girl looked at her with the wide eyes of someone hearing a thing they have not been told before. And then she climbed down the rocks and walked north along the creek trail, and May watched her from the cliff face until the rhododendron closed around her. She understood afterward, in the weeks following the girl's departure, what had happened. Not what had happened to the girl, which was her own story, and not May's to tell or to hold. What had happened to May was that she had done exactly what Silas had done for her in January of 1898, which was to provide the specific thing that the situation required. Warmth, food, silence, the implicit permission to occupy a space without having to account for yourself, without asking for anything in return. She had received this, and now she had given it, and the giving had not diminished what she had received. It had compounded it the way the mountain's thermal mass compounded the heat she gave. It returning more than had been deposited because the return was not a transfer, but a multiplication. The 10th year, the garden's South Terrace produced more beans than she could eat, dry preserve, or trade at the Pikeville store, and she began leaving the surplus in a flat stone niche at the top of the hollow where the ridge trail crossed above the cliff, and the niche was always empty by the following Tuesday, which meant that someone on the ridge trail was collecting it, and she did not know who and did not need to know. The giving and the taking were complete transactions in themselves and required no additional information. The 12th year, a black bear investigated the chicken coop in September, and she sat at the coop entrance for 2 nights with the hickory staff she carried on difficult terrain, and the bear assessed the return on effort and decided against it, which she chose to interpret not as a victory, but as a negotiation resolved in a satisfactory direction. The coop sustained no damage. The chickens sustained significant emotional injury that expressed itself in 4 days of reduced laying, which she considered a reasonable cost. Curtis came to the Waterfall in the spring of the 13th year. He was 51 now, and the change in him from the man who had set the Methodist home letterhead on the kitchen table was considerable, not in the direction of softening exactly, but in the direction of specificity, the way that people who have spent years living with a mistake they cannot undo eventually stop trying to compensate for it and simply carry it, which changes the posture in a way that the spine records permanently. He had written in March the letter arriving at Hadley's store in the first week of April to say that he was going to come to Pikeville the second week of May and that he would very much like to see her if she was willing and available. And he used those exact words, willing and available, the courthouse words. But she heard underneath them what he was actually saying, which was that he was asking permission rather than announcing arrival. She wrote back and told him how to find the hollow. She heard him on the slope above the cliff before she saw him, his boots on the loose shale of the upper path, the sound of a man who has not spent much time on this kind of terrain, placing his feet with care because the terrain requires it, rather than because familiarity has made the placement automatic. He came down the cliff path slowly, and she stood at the pool's edge and watched him descend, this 51-year-old man who had her eye color and Dale's height and neither of their ease in a landscape. And she felt for him the love that parents feel for children who have grown into people the parent would not entirely have chosen, but cannot stop being responsible for a love that is not conditional on approval and is not diminished by disappointment and is therefore one of the more durable things the world produces. He reached the pool's edge. He looked at the waterfall now in its May volume, heavier than late summer, but not yet the full spring roar. And he looked at the cliff face and at the wall visible through the curtain, and at his mother standing on the rocks in her wool skirt and her repaired flannel shirtwaist and her resoled boots with the laces tied evenly. He stood there for a moment, and something moved through his face that she did not try to name, because naming it would have required him to defend it or deny it, and she wanted him to simply have it. He climbed the rocks. She climbed behind him, guiding him to the dry footholds, telling him with her hand where to place his next step. He stepped through the curtain's edge, and she followed him in, and they stood together in the room. She gave him time to take it in. He turned slowly the way a person turns when they are revising a long-held picture against a reality that is substantially different from what they imagined. Not just looking, but recalculating, the courthouse man in him working through the evidence of the wall and the hearth and the sleeping platform and the ordered shelf against 13 years of letters to a postal address in 3 searches that had returned nothing. He stood in the center of the room, and it worked on him, the way the room worked on everyone who entered it, honestly, the way a place that has been genuinely inhabited, rather than merely occupied, communicates something that has no name in architecture or in theology, but is immediately legible to any person who has learned to read it. Then he crossed to the back wall and placed his hand against the stone. Not the exploratory touch that Dobbins had made, not the long communion that Silas had taken. This was the hand of the son pressed against the evidence of what his mother had built and maintained alone for 13 years, the warmth moving through his palm and into his arm and into something behind his sternum that had been held closed for a long time and was now in the face of this particular and irrefutable warmth releasing. He stood there with his eyes not quite focused on anything in the room, and what he was feeling was not just the 62 degrees of the stone, but everything those degrees represented. Every morning fire she had laid alone, every winter night. The wall had held her every year. The mountain had kept the bargain she had made with it in the dark of October 1897. He said, "You built all of this." She said, "The mountain did most of it. I just introduced myself properly." He turned from the wall and looked at her, and she looked back, and the kitchen table was between them, still the Methodist home letterhead, and the years of Christmas postal orders, and the 3 failed searches, and the lie Silas had told twice on her behalf. And none of this could be undone, and neither of them was under the impression that it could be, and the room held all of it in the same way it held everything else, without judgment and without forgetting, as one more deposit in the long account of all that had passed here. Curtis reached into his coat pocket and took out a piece of paper. She looked at it. He was watching her look at it, watching for her face to close, and her face did not close because she could see from its size and fold that it was not a document, but a letter handwritten, and letters from him were not threats. He set it on the storage shelf, and he said, "I wrote you some things. There are some things that are easier on paper." She nodded. He would not be told that she agreed with him because she had spent a lifetime writing around the hard things herself, and that particular apple had not fallen far. Then he said, "I want to visit more often. Not to he stopped, reorganized. "I want to visit because I want to know you, not to take you anywhere, not to fix anything. I'm not under the impression that anything here needs fixing." He looked around the room again, and in the looking was the acknowledgement that the room was the evidence, and the evidence was conclusive, and the courthouse man in him knew what conclusive evidence required of you, which was the revision of your previous position. "I want to visit because you are my mother, and I have not known you well enough, and that is my failure, and I would like to start making different choices about it while there is still time to make them." She looked at him for a moment. This man who had Dale's height and her eyes, who had left at 17 on a wagon and not looked back, who had searched for her 3 times across the plateau's ridges and hollows and found nothing, who was standing now in her waterfall room asking if he could come back. She thought about the flat stone niche at the top of the hollow where she left the surplus beans, and they were always gone by Tuesday, and she had never needed to know who took them. She thought about Silas sitting on the working stone drinking his cup of water and saying nothing for an hour and then leaving. She thought about the girl climbing down the rocks and walking north into the rhododendron. She said, "Come when you can, don't make it a project." Something in him released at this visibly attention she had not seen because it had been there since he arrived, and it left all at once. And what remained was the face of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has just been told he can set it down for a while and rest. They sat together beside the laid fire, and she lit it, and the cherry wood caught, and the smoke rose into the fissure, and the room filled with the smell of a fire in an enclosed stone space, which is a smell that has no equivalent in any other context, the smell of warmth with mass behind it, the smell of time recorded in heat. He stayed for the afternoon. He asked about the garden, and she showed him the terrace above, and he looked at the beans coming in along the stakes and the squash spreading across the south end, and the potatoes hilled and green. And he said, "You built this from nothing." And she said, "I built it from 42 years of knowing how, which is a different kind of nothing." And he was quiet with that for a moment, which was the right response. He left before dark because the ridge trail required light, and he was not a person who knew it by feel. She walked him to the top of the cliff path and watched him climb the slope above and disappear over the ridge into the late afternoon light. And this time he paused at the ridge line and turned back and raised his hand, and she raised hers, and then he was gone over the crest, and the hollow was hers again in the long May evening. She descended the cliff path and went into the room. She added wood to the fire. She unfolded Curtis's letter and read it standing in the firelight, And it said the things he had not been able to say in person, the true things, the structural things, the words written around for 20 years in courthouse cadence that had finally found their plain form on the page. She read it twice and then folded it carefully and placed it on the storage shelf between the tobacco tin and the canvas sack where things that needed keeping were kept. That night, before she lay down, she placed her palm flat against the back wall. The stone was 62 degrees. 13 years of morning fires were held in it, the first uncertain ones, in the deep-laid ones of the hard winters, in the careful managed ones of the seasons when the room needed only tending rather than rescue. All of it was in the stone, and the stone was returning it through her palm, steady and unconditional. The oldest bargain in the world: give the mountain your heat and your years and your honest daily presence, and the mountain will hold all of it and give it back. She lay down on the sleeping platform with the wool blanket over her and the warm wall at her back, and the waterfall spoke in the dark hollow below. And May Calloway closed her eyes in the room she had measured with her own feet and built with her own hands. And outside, the May stars appeared one by one above the ridge, and the water ran down the cliff face and through the gravel channel to the creek below, continuing its work in the dark, as it always had, as it always would, indifferent to the passage of human lives and entirely faithful to its own.